Hi, I'm Dale Sherbeck, and welcome to the HQ, a CHA Learning and Healthcare Can podcast serial where we dive into healthcare issues and topics from the perspective of its people and discuss them with those that are leading in the health system. Together, we'll try to unpack these topics and learn what actions are being taken to innovatively solve them today. So let's start with just a simple question for each of us to ponder. What is it to be a good person? Take a few seconds, think about that, and begin your ruminations while I start my intro. Which is important because today marks the final episode, or at least our final planned episode, in our series on equity, diversity, inclusion, and indigenization, which we began almost 4 months ago. 10 plus episodes later, we've touched on many facets of this culture shift, and I personally feel a lot more enlightened. So while this episode will mark the end of what we set out to do, I know it won't be the end of the discussion on the HQ, and as they emerge, we'll continue to invite other guests on who can continue to help us on our learning journey. All that said, let's get back to my question. What is it to be a good person? It's an important question, not just in general, but because at the heart of so much of what we've been talking about over this series has been about being good, or more good. And it has certainly been central to my conversation with Gaynor Watson Creed about the difference between how the world is and how it should be. It centers around the notion of doing things right, treating people with kindness and respect. At the same time, we've talked a lot about power and leadership and empathy and many other loaded words and concepts that are necessary to support this. But how does all this fit together? How do these words fit together in us? And how do they fit together in a good life? To answer these and many other questions, I'm thrilled to be joined by Bashir Jiwani, who is a bioethicist with a doctorate from the University of Alberta. Bashir is Executive Director, Ethics and Diversity Services at the Fraser Health Authority, which serves one of Canada's largest, fastest growing, and most diverse regional populations. Bashir leads a team that provides decision support in patient care and at a system level builds capacity to deal with complex, ethically challenging situations in context of diversity, enables access to language, resources, and builds partnerships for understanding and collaborating with diverse communities. The team's overall goal is to support patients, care providers, and members of the public to improve their quality of life and live with greater integrity through their engagement with the health system. Bashir currently serves on the Drug Benefit Council for BC, the Expensive Drugs for Rare Diseases Committee for BC, and the core team for the Aga Khan University Thinking Group on Ethics, Stem Cell Science, and Regenerative Medicine, and is a consultant with the Ismaili Tariqa and Religious Education Board of Canada. Bashir is also the president of the Canadian Bioethics Society. Hi, Bashir, and welcome to the HQ.
Thank you so much for having me, Dale.
Yeah, I know having our little pre-conversation a few weeks ago, I've been really looking forward to having this more in-depth conversation with you today. So thank you for joining us today and helping us to sort of explore this topic from, I think a unique and very different perspective in terms of the ethics and I guess the moral aspects of what equity, diversity, and inclusion means. So perhaps we can start today's conversation with your job title itself, which juxtaposes diversity and ethics into one role. And I don't know how many peers you have across the country that have the same sort of titles, but it strikes me as a fairly unique one. So maybe you could start with, what is the relationship between ethics and diversity?
Yeah, let me just start by saying, again, I do appreciate being invited to the conversation, and of course, I'm on my own learning journey, trying to make sense of these ideas, and I'm happy to share my thoughts with you. I think that what's interesting is that even at our own organization, we're thinking about the relationship between these conceptually and operationally, and trying to figure out what the best way of dealing with that is. So we're on that journey at Fraser Health as well. I think that in bioethics, there's a much greater understanding of the relevance of these ideas of responding to diversity and inequality in society and ethics. And I think that all of my colleagues across the country, and I would say, even around the world, are trying to make sense of these. And we've had the blessing of the opportunity to formally bring these together at Fraser Health. And it's been a really interesting journey. So I'm happy to share the way I've been thinking about this. And
Yeah.
here's kind of where I've landed, or at least where my story is today. So, for me, ethics is, we start by coming to ethics to say, well, what's the right thing to do here? I'm struggling. I've got a patient for whom I think this is the best thing. The family thinks one thing and the patient themselves wants something completely different. How do I figure out what the right thing to do is? So ethics, in a sense, is about what's the right thing to do. But as you've pointed to, um, the right thing to do for each of us is going to depend on what it means to be a good person, right? So if I'm trying to make a decision for a patient, part of my job as a physician or as a social worker is to try to figure out what does it mean to be a good social worker? And that's nested within a bigger idea of what it means to be a good human being. And so that's really interesting, because then what does it mean to be a good human being? Well, it raises questions about, well, what's the purpose of my life exactly? What am I trying to achieve in the work that I'm doing? What is my relationship with other people? What are the goods that I'm trying to help them to achieve? And so ethics is about asking these kinds of questions. And each of us, in my opinion, is on a journey to trying to understand, what should my life look like? And then how do I apply that in the day-to-day issues that I face? So that's kind of how I start with the ethics part of it. And then what I observe is that, well, as I'm on this journey to try to figure out what is the meaning in life and how does that impact the choices I make every day, I recognize that I'm doing this in I'm not doing this alone. I can't do this by myself. I'm doing it with other people, in
Mm-hmm.
relationship with other people, in partnership with other people. And more in society today, certainly here in Vancouver, in Surrey, in Vancouver, in BC, and Canada, and around the world even, the people I'm relating to are different than I am in a very important respects. So now I'm negotiating questions of meaning in relationship with people who are different than me. So I need a disposition to difference. In my journey to being ethically justified, making ethically justified choices and being a good human being, I need to figure out, how am I going to react to people who are different than me? And so for me, the first part of, if we're going to look at the DEI framework, diversity, equity, inclusion, well, the diversity piece is the acknowledgement of the fact of diversity, and then having a disposition to diversity, an attitude to diversity. When I dig this, and that means that I have to say, okay, I actually care about what other people think. This conversation matters to me to participate with you, Dale, and with your audience, because we as Canadians need to work together to figure these things out. So
Yeah.
my disposition to diversity is actually that it's a good thing. I want to learn in my journey from you. I want you to learn with me and go together. So notice the relevance of inclusion in that my disposition to diversity really matters. And then as I think about the diversity of the people in the society I live in, at a small level and at a larger level, it's not a it's a society where there is deep inequality. And so I have to pay attention to that inequality to say, okay, if I need to learn from other people in order for me to figure out what a good life is, so I can make good choices in my life every day, then I need to recognize that the people who I'm relating to occupy very different places in the power hierarchies in society and have different opportunities to have their perspective heard, different opportunities to, when we get to equity and talk health equity, talk to outcomes in their own well-being, which impacts their ability to participate in society. So I have to have an attitude towards inequity, and that motivates an idea, commitments to equity. So ethics is about living a good life as individuals, but we can't do that without doing that in community. And the community we live in is diverse. So we have to figure out how are we going to work together to actually learn from each other and help us all flourish as human beings. So that's one way of making sense of this relationship. What do you think?
I think, yeah, I think it's, well, the way you say it, it's like, well, it's simple. Like, so what's the problem, right? So, but I mean, I guess that sort of brings the question, like, we all, I mean, most people, I would say, apart from, right, the rarities in life, right, all have an intention to be good, I would assume, right? And to do good things and to be judged as good. Um, Yet we still, in that context, have things like racism, discrimination, oppression, and the kinds of inequalities that you described. So, what's getting in the way? If we all have the same ambition about wanting to be good, then what's stopping us from doing that?
It's such a brilliant question, in my opinion, and it's one that we all really do, I think, need to grapple with, each of us. So I want to offer maybe two parts to my response, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
The first is I do believe, I agree with you that we're all trying to be good. I'm a firm believer that everyone makes choices because those choices they believe give them what matters to them in life, right? And
Mm-hmm.
we don't like choices some people make, but if we really bend our brains and our hearts to understand where they're coming from, we can see why they're doing that. It's giving them some sense of what's good in their life, good for them. And we might disagree with what's good with them, but that's what they're trying to do. So the first point I want to make is, yeah, I believe everyone is trying to do good. I also think that there's a diversity of understanding what good means.
Mm-hmm.
I also don't believe that everyone is born with a positive disposition to difference.
Yes.
So I think that we're born and we're going to come, the way we grow up, we're actually very conservative and we want to keep our own ideas and our own traditions. And we have to work hard to understand the equal dignity of other people and the importance of respecting them and understanding their perspectives and working with them. So that's something I don't think we're born with, and that we actually need to work. We need education to teach our children about the fact of diversity and the equal dignity of other human beings. That's the first part of the solution, that our own individual sort of character, our nature, is a little bit more complicated than we're all trying to do good for each other in the same ways. It's not
Mm-hmm.
quite that way, in my opinion. I think the other part of the response I would give to this question, I think, is that I think we really need to understand the relevance of history in our lives. We have a tendency to see sort of the absolutization of the transient is a phrase that a philosopher by the name of Sayyid Hussein Nasr talks about. The idea that we kind of think the way the world is today is the way it's always been.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact of the matter is it's not. That we've inherited traditions of thinking, of ideas, of values, of conflicts, and we're very much in a flow of time. And so if you think about that in the context of your question of why are things so hard, well, the reality is that our history in Canada is where you've had for millennia, thousands of years, Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, well, you know
Mm-hmm.
where I'm going with this, who have lived in this land with traditions, with culture, with language. And then hundreds of years ago, we had other peoples from Europe come with ideas that were very conservative, ideas that about racial superiority, and coming with ideas of patriarchy, and coming with military might, coming with all kinds of other things, negative things. And what happened was that this land was very complicated, and there was a colonial authority that came into being. And that colonial authority put all kinds of institutions and systems and structures in place that sort of normatized a way of living.
Mm-hmm.
And that way of living included all kinds of inappropriate prejudices, inappropriate discriminations, and very much met the needs of that European community, and at the expense of the indigenous peoples at the time. And then, of course, we've had a long history of immigration after that from people from different parts of the world. But notice, so as you've had in our history, as you've had this evolution, you've had a certain understanding happen where people say, well, no, now we're starting to understand that everyone has dignity, that their traditions deserve to be respected, and we need to come together to genuinely try to help each other to flourish. But we're doing this in a context where our institutions, our systems, and our structures and our society effectively is still built on those ideas of coloniality.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way we operate privileges certain ways of understanding the world. And if I may, if it's helpful, let me give you a practical kind of example, right?
Yeah, please do.
One of the things that we do then is so you build a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's obviously a very good thing for the community, for the society. But notice all of the decisions that are implicit in the hospital building. You build a hospital in an urban center. Already now you're thinking about whether explicitly or implicitly the difference between people that live in urban centers versus rural communities, and who
Mm-hmm.
has access to those resources. You build a healthcare system or a hospital, let's say, that's focused on an understanding of illness and health
Mm-hmm.
and a medicalized approach to how to improve and deal with illness and disease. Already that's privileging certain kinds of epistemologies, right? This is what good healthcare looks like. And traditional medicines, things like that, fall outside of the bounds of what's normal. So you're looking at tradition now and privileging one tradition over another. You offer services in English.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that language, all of a sudden, there's a privileged language, there's a proper language, and everything else that falls outside of that. You build rooms for individuals and nuclear families, which tells you then that we're privileging the ways of thinking about family and that narrow community as nuclear, as opposed to broader understandings of family. You ask questions that are focused on the right to autonomy. You ask for informed consent, which means that the most relevant values in guiding a healthcare decision are in individuals, as opposed to a families, or as opposed to the way that that family dynamic works together. You call people by the names that are on their birth certificates or their driver's licenses, which means that you're privileging some ideas of gender identity and how to think about those kinds of things. So you can see how the way we build our system automatically privileges certain ways of understanding what a good life looks like.
Yeah.
And you create conditions where now we have to negotiate and we have to figure out, okay, how do we make sense of this in a world of diversity where we are automatically marginalizing people because of the way we set things up? And I'm not, when I describe this example, I'm not trying to say one is good or bad. I'm simply problematizing this to say, this is why when you ask, we're having issues of racism and not treating people with discrimination. Well, it's because we live in a context that's in time, in history, and we're now trying to figure out what's the story we should have as we move this forward, and how do we do the right thing to be demonstrating this commitment to equal respect that I think you're right that many of us are committed to in Canadian society.
Yeah, and I think what you've described there, Bashir, I think is extremely helpful because I mean one of the topics or things that we've been trying to navigate is the idea of structural discrimination or oppression, right, or institutional oppression, like however you want to do that, and I think for some, and as we've talked about, there's notable politicians and other leaders, right, who've denied that these things exist. But I think when you describe exactly what you've just done, I think you show that it does. I mean, and it's again not to shame or blame people, but it is a reality of what we're trying to navigate. So that I think those structures, as you've outlined them, I mean they force conflict, don't they? As we as individuals and our beliefs and values have to navigate through those different barriers or structures.
Yeah, I think that the worry in a sense is this idea of neutrality, right? This idea that, well, of course our systems are neutral. They're not, we live in a society where people are in principle have equal rights and equal access to resources. But it implies that the context is neutral and it's not sensitive to that, as we've talked about, the biases that are inherent. And I think part of the worry here is that people take this personally. Well, you're blaming me, as you've said, and I don't think that's the purpose. I think that we're not saying that the society is set up this way right now, today, maliciously necessarily,
Mm-hmm.
but that the conventional ways that we teach our kids things like what we teach in school and what we teach our healthcare providers and what we practice in terms of the way we work with different people, well, those are biased in the way that everything is biased. I mean, I'm biased.
Yeah.
And the work we have to do is simply to try to really critically self-reflect with humility to understand what our biases are and figure out together how we should live.
Yeah, I mean what we say and what we do comes at the expense of what we don't say and don't do, right? So we're always making a privileged, decision in that, and that's going to have other kinds of consequences. But I mean, I guess there's also in that, as you talk about the disposition for difference as well, and our individual values, and we navigate. So philosophically, I guess, right? There's also still that challenge, and I would be, very interested in your perspective on this, right? Between that of the individual and that of the community, right? And how you reconcile those two things about what is good for you, what versus what's good for your community or for others. So how do we reconcile this together? I guess in some of this in these discussions, as well as in terms of how we lead within that space.
Yeah, I think that I think that's hard. I think that, but here's the way I make sense of it. I think, first of all, I think that this interesting notion of individual versus community. Again, I want to just point out that historical location of that, right? That different the way this shows up is different, has been different in different times of history, and is different in different contexts, geographic contexts in the world, with different traditions and different practices and things like that. So this whole idea is interesting. I think that. Um, I think that one big picture way of trying to make sense of it, at least I've been trying to make sense of it this way, recognizing it, is sort of the whole the challenge of liberalism in a way, the idea of liberalism, right? So this idea that there was a recognition that there was inequality in society, and that's problematic, and that actually everyone has equal dignity, and so everyone ought to have equal respect, right? And so this idea of equal rights, equal respect is something that's very important. Now, that notion is something that wants to be blind to difference, right? I actually don't want to worry about the particulars of who you are. What I want to do is make sure that you're treated the same, you have the same access to the rights and privileges of everybody else, and I want to prevent you from being discriminated against. I'm not interested in your particular specifics. But then there's this idea of respecting difference, allowing people to be their authentic selves.
Mm-hmm.
That whole approach involves being hypersensitive to difference and giving people what they need, in a sense, to be different. But that's in tension with the idea of making sure that we're treating everybody equally.
Mm-hmm.
And we're struggling with that all the time. And you see that today, for example, the interesting rhetoric, and perhaps it's more than that, in our provincial politics today, where you've got, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Quebec, all three of them wanting to, focus on this idea of being distinct sovereign spaces in their own way, recognizing their own unique cultures and their own group. So notice that there's a call for respect for difference. And yet, then that calls into question, what does it mean to be part of Canada? And that kind of conversation is playing out all over the place, right? Like, and so how much attention do we pay to the needs of Indigenous peoples? Why are we focusing only on Indigenous peoples? How do we? And what sort of side point I'll quickly make is, notice that when we talk about discrimination, the easy thing for us to talk about is the color of people's skin. But remember that discrimination difference is on multiple levels, from age to ability, to whether people are incarcerated or not, and there's all kinds of relevant differences that are actually irrelevant for the way we might say we should treat people, the equal dignity that they have. But anyway, so I think we're trying to navigate every day this tension, and this is the way to think about it. In one way, is how do we make sure everyone is treated equally, and at the same time appropriately, specially? What's the appropriate amount of special attention we should pay to different individuals and different groups? That's the challenge, and we can talk more about that.
Mm-hmm.
From my perspective, I think that we can talk about it philosophically, but what's most important is, or the answer to this, in my opinion, to some extent, is how we talk about it in everyday conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that, and this is where I think the ethics has, the way my perspective of ethics has the most promise. Because I think that ethics is lived every day in the conversations we have. So when we are making a particular decision for a patient, whether that patient's in their home or in the hospital, who is involved in that conversation, and how are they treated, and how are we navigating the practical difference at that level? And how are we thinking about the biases that we're bringing to those conversations? Or if we're thinking about a policy, where to build a hospital, who's going to get, whose needs are we going to be privileging when we have certain, vaccine allocations? Where are we going to put, or how are we going to support people coming to an immunization center? I mean, all kinds of different things. Who's going to get a surgery first? Whatever it is. Those decisions happen in conversations between human beings. And so that's where kind of the rubber can hit the road, in my opinion, where we ask ourselves, okay, where we can bring ethics also from another way of ethics, understanding ethics for me is about literacy. It's about the skills to think critically about the values that are relevant and most important in a situation, about the evidence that justify our understanding of the facts related to those values, and then about coming up with a solution that best lives up to those well-justified values. And for me, critical thinking, good critical thinking, is not something that happens in anyone's head. It actually happens with other people in conversation. So when I'm leading a group trying to ask the question, what should our anti-bullying policy be? Or how do I deal with a patient who meets brain death criteria and the family disagrees that their loved one is actually dead? Or all these kinds of questions. I'm asking the question, who's in that conversation? Whose values count? What assumptions and biases are we making that we need to be mindful of? How are we interpreting evidence to justify our understanding of what the facts in the situation are? And it's that where we can actually make some headway to thinking about the relationship between individual and community. I know that seems like a big leap, but that's where we figure out what our connections to each other are and what should matter. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does, especially as you bring it together at the end there, because I think what you're describing in terms of the conversations, right, is that those conversations, if I'm understanding correctly, are also important because they bring in those facts, I guess, that experiences or those, right, the elements that are necessary to make those decisions ethically. And I guess, looking in hindsight, right, we may observe that some people or decision makers have made some of those decisions without those conversations in the room. I think like one that certainly strikes me is the policy decisions we made around how we locked down our long-term care facilities, right, during the start of the pandemic, and the impact that obviously had on the people who lived and worked there. Decisions obviously publicly were made, to protect people, but the consequences perhaps did not value, I guess, those that had to live through those decisions. I mean, am I capturing that right, or is that a fair corollary to sort of what you've been describing?
Yeah, I think it's a really good example. So we're in the midst of a pandemic. We don't know much about this virus, but then we learn that those who are elderly are most susceptible to catching this virus and then to having really significant health consequences as a result. They could get sick and die. So it's really important that we protect them. And so, and we meet their needs as much as possible. So what we do is we kind of lock them down in a way. We prevent people from coming in and we prevent people from coming out of those facilities so that those vectors of transmission are minimized as much as possible. That's really reasonable, right? That makes good sense if you just look at it narrowly. But the question is, who's doing that critical? So that decision is, and I want to say that I think we're always doing this ethics stuff, right? We're always doing critical thinking, whether we realize it or not. And part of when I say ethics is about literacy, it's about the skill building to do that critical thinking that we're always doing well and better and better and better. And so you have this policy and you have to make a decision quickly. So how are you going to make that? Who's going to be involved in that decision? What are you going to allow to come into the conversation in terms of what other things should matter? How do you understand the well-being of a senior or someone who's in a long-term care facility? Is it the case that you are going to be focused on their physiological survival? Are you interested in their relational well-being? Are you worried about their mental health? How do you understand the health and well-being of a human being, and particularly a human being that's in that setting. Well, that calculation happened for whoever made that decision. So what I'm asking for is that we examine that, and that's where you're right. We would be trying to improve our thinking. The other thing I quickly want to say about that is, we're a very judgmental society, and we have to be. We have to take each other to task for the choices we make. Absolutely. But I do think that everyone is really trying to do their best, and I
Yeah.
think the problem with this judgmental approach that we all have, and frankly, I'd frame it as a lack of humility, is that then it becomes very scary to be transparent and inclusive in decision making contexts.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we need to do, is we need to sort of allow people to make decisions. And we can talk, you mentioned leadership in a second, and we can talk about that. But then recognize that people are doing their best, and then support them to identify where the gaps in their thinking were, because there are always gaps in our thinking, and how we can continue to improve the choices we make individually, as teams, and at social level.
So yeah, we will touch on some more of those things, I think, for sure. But I think this is very well. It's enlightening. It's provocative, and but I think you're breaking down some of these very complex issues for us in ways that we can meaningfully, I think, engage in conversations to work through, to come to solutions that may not be best, right? But at least things that we can all justify, I guess, in terms of our approaches. So one of the things that you mentioned a few minutes ago was, as you were trying to unpack the differences around, being equal and being special. And that has been some of the conversations as we've had the conversation around equity, diversity, and inclusion that we've been trying to navigate. And I think it has been something about trying to honor people's differences and diversity with a sense of belonging, but also, I think that the challenges in the dialogues have been trying to tease out, and I think perhaps we see it even more so within our organizations as they try and navigate this, about the difference between equity and equality, and how those two things shape, I think, exactly as you're saying, right, how we deal with difference. And I guess it'll manifest in terms of our ability to create inclusion. So maybe you could share your perspective on that in a bit more detail.
Happy to try, for sure. The way I make sense of this is that I think so. Equality. So these are both states, right? Equality
Yep.
and equity, in a sense, that we're trying to achieve. So what is it that we're trying to equalize, and what are we trying to have more equitable? What does that look like? So for me, equality is when in some relevant respect, things are the same or treated the same. And where equality for me matters is that we recognize that each human being has dignity, and we equally have I don't like rights language, but I'll say the right to be treated with that dignity respected.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think all of us are worthy of that. By virtue of the fact that you are a human being, I have duties to treat you well, to understand you, to understand your perspective, and that you are have an equal place, in a sense, in our community of people. I also think that in the world I live in, that we have a duty to think about equal outcomes. The fact of the matter is, health outcomes. The
Yep.
fact of the matter is that for socially constructed reasons, there is great inequality in the health outcomes that people have. There are communities and subgroups of populations that have very poor, that have health outcomes that don't match the rest of society, the middle class in society. I'll say it that way. And so there is this, and for me, health is particularly important because I think we all agree that we all ought to be able to, have the best lives we can, and it's okay for us to be different in what that best life looks like. But what's interesting is that health is strategically important for me to determine the range of that it determines the range of choices from which I can determine, choose a type of life that I want. With certain kinds of health impairments, health impediments, there are certain ways of being that I just don't have access to. So we all need health so that we can actually, have a good range of choices from which we can actually go out and live good lives as we understand them to be. So I think that we have commitments to equal health outcomes to some extent and equal respect, absolutely, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
The social dynamics then result in, as I said, existing inequalities. Some people are not treated with equal respect today, and some people don't have an equal or something close to an equal health status. So equity is about saying how are we going to allocate our resources. Equity is about saying, where am I going to put we can't do everything for everyone, so who should get the resources that we have to try to improve people's lives? So equity is about saying I'm going to allocate resources to those who need it most.
Mm-hmm.
To answer that question, you need to know what the criteria are that you're interested in trying to address. And so equity depends on criteria. Once we understand what the criteria we're looking at are, then we can look at the patterns of distribution of inequality and the different patterns we can by which we can allocate resources. And then the pattern will not be equal, but it will it'll be equitable to the extent that it meets the needs of those people who have the greatest need based on the criterion you happen to be looking at or looking for. So that's the way I understand these things. I don't know if that was helpful, but that's sort of that's the way I make sense of it.
Well, I'd say like we should drop the mic there because I think that's perfect because I think it's a nice extension of the conversation I had with Dr. Watson or Gaynor Watson Creed, because I mean that was the conversation we were having around people who have different outcomes, right, or different experiences, and we were talking about Black people, Indigenous people, right, more specifically, that they don't need equal health care, right? That there's a fallacy in that because they are in a position of inequity and such. They need, I think as you're saying, right, that the equitable thing to do would be to provide them more or different, right, to allow them to achieve equal outcomes, which is where I guess fairness comes into it, or decency, or whatever we want to define that as. I think, so I think you much better than I just did, but you certainly I think were perfect in disentangling I think those terms that we grow up with as children and think everything should be equal and fair, but when you don't start from a position of sameness, right, then our journeys perhaps have to be different.
Yeah, and to just try to make I apologize, I was a bit sort of abstract in my description, but just very, very practically, because just COVID is a great example again, right? Where we want to minimize the spread of this virus, right? And
Mm-hmm.
but we all believe that everybody needs to be equally protected against this virus, because very selfishly, if the higher the risk other people are in the society, the greater the risk to me of catching the virus. Okay, so we all want this equally. So then we're going to do immunization and testing. Okay, so where are we going to put our immunization and testing resources? Well, if you put it in one place, if you put it in an urban center, and you fail to go to those refugee communities that are outside of that urban center, where it's very difficult for them to come to this urban center to get to access to that, you're going to be you're not going to be treating people equally. You're not also going to meet your need. Like, you're not going to get there. Or so let me put it. So I guess what I'm trying to say, I'm doing this badly, but the community is different. They live in different settings. So you've got small communities of refugees. You've got clinics on indigenous lands. You've got people, people living in highly populated communities. What I found interesting is that I didn't know this, and I don't know this well enough, but that some of the health systems in some of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit settings are entirely run by volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that if you're going to, I can just plop a center down, but that's not going to meet my needs. So what I need to do is actually decide on who has the greatest need and put more resources where there's greater need. So maybe I need to privilege those people who are living in smaller communities that are isolated and make it harder to get to the larger center to make sure that I'm meeting my goal of equal outcomes. Maybe I need to actually throw resources at some of our maybe chartered communities to make sure that they have the resources to effectively run an immunization or vaccination clinic or a testing clinic, whatever it is. So it's that idea that we have to figure out where the need is and then go there to meet that need. And it's not going to be an equal distribution. It's going to privilege some over others. That's what we need to do in order to achieve this idea of equal outcomes. But I want to push a little bit because I think that the equal outcomes is one part of it. So this argument says that we all should have an equal quality of life, let's put it that way for a moment. And so in order to do that, we need to have different allocations to different people because their needs are greater or lesser. And that's how we should, and the goal is to get equal outcomes. Part of the complexity, though, of our society today is that it's not just about equal outcomes. It's actually about equal respect for culture. So here, I think it's very interesting that we're saying, well, it's not just that I want to be able to participate equally in a set of rights and responsibilities in society, but there's something special about my tradition that you need to help me to to survive. We need to be treated differently so that my tradition can survive. That's what's happening in Quebec. That's what's happening with our Indigenous communities, that we're saying actually there's something very unique and special about that culture. It's not about equalizing their opportunity to access rights and privileges in society, but it's actually about their identity. That there's something special about that we need to honor. And that introduces another interesting complexity in these discussions, I think.
Yeah, and I think, well, at the risk of saying something inappropriate, but I think that element that you just added, I think, defends against making decisions that would lead to things like residential school systems, right? Because that might have been argued as a mechanism to create equitable outcomes, right? But it didn't respect the differences, I guess, along the way, right? And maybe I'm oversimplifying that again, but it certainly, I think you point out an erroneous sort of decision-making process that does lead to catastrophic outcomes, if not weighing all those other aspects.
And also depends on your definition of respect, because it's about that idea that, well, I mean, that whole colonial mentality is that there are certain groups of people whose way of life is superior. And so I want to, and that mentality, the problem there is going to be that I'm actually not respecting you and your tradition and your identity as a human being. I'm imposing my understanding of what a good life looks like, my approach, my understanding of what a civilized human being looks like on others. So it starts with that fundamental arrogance about my understanding of what it means to be a good human being is superior, and I have an obligation to impose that on you. And I think that's where the commitment to equal rights and equal respect is actually, that's how we're trying to deal with, I think, conceptually, that kind of problem to some extent.
So bringing the conversation back, I guess, to the concept of leadership that you had said that we should explore. So I mean, it has been a topic that that's been weaving in and around the discussion about EDI and Indigenous reconciliation as well, and the role of leadership in terms of enabling so much of what we've talked about. So, I mean, these are complex issues, and leaders carry with them a lot of responsibility, but they also carry with them formal and informal sort of levels of power and all of that too. So how do you see the notion of ethics play itself out in the context of leadership, and how does that connect back to or enable our pursuit of EDI?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I think leadership is absolutely crucial for us to move through this. And I think that it's crucial in several ways. And but for me, leadership is formal and informal. So there are people who are the formal leaders of the teams, and then there are people who are charismatic and smart and who really can influence groups of people. I think that leaders have well, let me put it this way to start. I tell people I love power. But the reason I love it is because I think I have a reasonably well justified sense of how it ought to be allocated, and so I can try to allocate it and redistribute it in ways that are appropriate from my perspective. But I'm transparent about what I'm doing when I'm doing it. But I think that's the thing, is, as you said, leaders have power. How do they have power? Well, two important ways they have power. One, they create the containers for the conversations in their teams. Right? They determine how people are going to come together and talk together to work through problems. The second thing that they do is they set the agenda. They decide what we're going to talk about. Right. So if I just be practical, I'm a manager on a medicine unit at some hospital somewhere, or I'm a manager of a home care service, I've got a team. And so now I get to decide, when we come together to decide on our patient rosters, our standards of care, what change we're going to try to practice, how we're going to deal with our patients and families in both of these settings. I get to decide, first of all, who's going to be in that conversation, who's going to have airtime, how are we going to listen to each other, all of these kinds of things. And for me, that conversation space, as I've said, is crucial. And I have thoughts about, I think that, one thing I sometimes say, one thing I believe is that my job is to help people make hard decisions at various levels in society. That's my job. And what I notice is that almost all of the problems that I'm asked to provide support in would actually easily become, not easily, but be tractable, and actually may not even surface in the way that they do if people treat each other with respect. Now, no one's going to disagree with that in a high level, but I mean that in a very specific way. So I can tell you what I think about that in a minute, Dale, if that's useful.
Yes,
but what I want to back to leadership, I think leaders create the container that determines the way we treat each other as we negotiate questions. In terms of the agenda, that leader is going to have the authority to say, hey, let's put on our agenda the reflective exercise of asking who our services privilege, and who our services disempower, who has access to us and who doesn't but needs that access, and how we're treating different people. What assumptions are we making in our care practice, in our treatment practice every day? That leader has the authority to set that agenda and create the space to talk about those hard problems. If every leader in our system, wherever we worked, critically thought about the agendas they wanted to create and brought these to the table, and then created appropriate conversation spaces to navigate their part of the problem, I think that we would actually see a radical change in the way that we work. So all of us have power as leaders, informally and formally, that we can use to change the world drastically. And that's not just in our professional settings, that's around the dining table as well. That's everywhere we have teams, whether you call them families or you call them boards.
Yeah. No, and that's perfect. I mean, I think because in my domestic team, right, we've, and my son, right, from some of his earliest times, right, one of the things that we talked about, and we introduced the concept of respect and what it meant to our family, right? It was a family value. And so we continue to build on that as he continues to grow and we navigate what that looks like in the real world. But so you've talked about it, and you promised that we would come back to it. So I will take you up on that, because I do think that it's as evidenced by my family, right? It's something that we use somewhat trivially, flippantly, easily, but what does it really mean? So back to you.
Thank you. And I applaud you and your family for doing that. I think part of the worry is because it's a platitude, that it becomes fluff and meaningless. And I think even the definition I'll offer in a moment, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. I think that the work respect needs to do is that a group of people who are working together on a problem need to agree on a very specific standard and then hold themselves and each other to that standard. That's the only time this will actually work. Otherwise, again, we're just contributing to the fluff in the conversation about what this word means. So the way I talk about this in a very practical way is that when you're working with other people, To treat them with respect is to demonstrate 3 behaviors to them. And I'm not talking about decision making. I need to be clear. Then that's the next step in the process. This is simply how we treat each other. I think the first thing that respect requires is simply treating people kindly, gently, and well. In the literature, you'll see that it's called unconditional positive regard. The fact that you're human suggests that there's something very special about you. I need to treat you well. And nobody disagrees with that. And yet I see so much absence of that in the way that we treat each other in society. And so as I thought about this, I think that this idea of treating each other kindly, for me, is actually tied to this idea of power. I notice that there are people in my life who I don't treat well sometimes. I'll be frank and say, sometimes my sister, my mom, my son, sometimes some of the people who report to me, I may actually take liberties with them in the way that I react to them. And by that, what I mean is that I'll be upset, so I'll speak rudely to them or loudly to them or things like that. I'm not proud of this. I'm ashamed of it, actually. But I realize that I do that. But what's interesting to me is that when I sit back and think about it, and I imagine that my boss did the exact same thing, or my wife did the same thing, I wouldn't react in the same way to them as I do to these other people. What's the difference? I have power over these other people in a way that I don't over my boss or my wife. And so what's happening is that I'm abusing my power, my authority over these people who rely on me for certain things. And so who have to put up with my guff because they need to get that stuff from me for their well-being and to flourish. So it requires them to be more patient than me, with me, than others do. So I'm using my power inappropriately here. So what it means for me to treat people kindly, gently, and well is to treat them as if they have as much or more power in the relationship with me, even when they don't. And if you think about your relationships, and I'm thinking about the healthcare setting, if you go and treat every patient as if they have as much more power than you, even if they don't, you can imagine the change in the dynamic of the conversations we would be having. It's radical, in my opinion. Your children, same thing. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So that's the first layer of behavior I think respect requires. The second thing that I think respect requires is deep listening. We're very familiar with our perspectives. And we're familiar with our perspectives, and because we feel the visceral experience of that. In other words, I'm familiar with my emotions. I know what's in my heart and in my mind, and so I know my perspective. And when I'm right, I feel it. I feel absolutely passionate about the fact that this is true. And what's interesting, and I have to work to try to imagine what's in your heart or in your mind. And so what's interesting about that dynamic is, I once watched a TED Talk where somebody asked the question, what does it feel like to be wrong? What does it feel like to be wrong? And I think, the common understanding or the common answer is, well, it feels humiliating, embarrassing, and things like that, which, by the way, I think is a problem about that judgmental society I mentioned earlier. But actually, that's not what it feels like to be wrong. That's what it feels like when you find out you're wrong.
Yes.
Until you find out you're wrong, it feels exactly the same to be wrong as it does to be right.
Yeah. You're describing what it feels like to be accountable, right? So.
Yeah, in a sense. But where I'm going with this is that if I'm wrong about something, until I realize my error, I'm still passionate in my conviction. And if I don't have the humility to put my stuff aside, then I rob myself of the opportunity to actually understand where someone else is coming from. And I rob them of the opportunity to be heard, which is their due as a human being. So the second thing that respect requires for me is listening without judgment, at the beginning anyway, suspending our judgment, having the humility to put our side, recognizing the situation, the limitedness of our perspective, and trying to understand, Dale, where are you coming from? What do you think is important in this situation? What are the facts as you see them, and why? What's the evidence you're relying on? And how are you feeling about all of this? That's what respect requires, that second thing. And then the third thing I think respect requires is showing up, is actually sharing your perspective and saying, Dale, as we have this conversation, we're trying to figure out what family visitation should look like. I understand. We're having a conversation where we're treating each other well. I'm really trying to understand your perspective, but now I want you to understand where I'm coming from. This is what I think is important and why. This is what I think the facts of the world are and why. This is how I'm feeling about it and why. And showing up is about two things. It's about sharing, articulating, communicating, but it's also about doing that with a disposition to collaborating.
Mm-hmm.
It's about saying, I'm sharing this not because I want to convince you I'm right and you're wrong. It's about saying, this is where I am. I understand where you are. Now, how do we move through this issue together? Because we're both impacted by it. We both have a space at the table. We both have to do it together. How do we do that? And that's what I think respectful engagement looks like. And it's damn hard. But that's what it requires, and that's what I'm saying. I think leaders have the opportunity to bring to their tables, to sort of say, this is what we're going to ask of each other collaboratively, and then to actually hold each other accountable to that as we navigate hard questions.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in what you've shared there, Bashir. So I guess I won't do it justice to try to sort of weave it all back together again, but I'm wondering maybe just to sort of continue on that conversation, because the other theme, I guess, or concept that comes into this a little bit around, equity, diversity, inclusion, the role of leadership, right? And these concepts around psychological safety or creating safe spaces. So, and I think you've described a little bit of that, but I'm just maybe to extend some of what you've just described in terms of the role of safety and the role of the leader in that and how it all plays out, and guess in terms of achieving this.
Yeah. And so I think this is sort of like the cultural safety mindset in a way that we're trying to create in a way. And the correlate of that, of course, is humility, right? So I think that I think one way to think about this is that to some extent, we all know who we are. I know who I am. But I'm also making myself as I go through the journey of life. I'm trying to find meaning in situations and in things that I confront. And as I do, I confront new situations all the time, variations of old situations, but new in their own way. And I get stumped because I don't know how to deal with them. So I'm actually trying to figure out what my meaning is as I try to move forward and what the right thing to do is. And so I don't know. I genuinely don't know what the right thing to do is sometimes, often actually. And we're all like that. And so, in order for us to ideally make meaning together, which is what I think I'm advocating for, which I think that sort of this commitment to overall equality requires, we need to be able to be vulnerable together. We need to be able to show up in ways that say, this is what's important to me, and this is what I think is true. And now, in this novel situation, I'm not entirely sure what I should do. And I think healthcare is a great example of this, because what often happens in life is that we go through, we do fine. We have enough of a sense of who we are, and we kind of go through life, and we're reasonably okay. And we don't think too deeply about too many things. And so we're able to just navigate the problems that we face. And then all of a sudden we face a serious issue, a health issue. We get into an accident and get really deeply injured, or we have a disease, or a family member gets sick and is, hurting. And all of a sudden we have to face these very difficult questions about, holy cow, what relationships matter in my life? What activities make sense in my life? What are good goals of care to have? What does a good quality of life look like that I should try to pursue it? Because I need to figure these things out so that I can decide what the appropriate, and our healthcare providers can help us understand what the appropriate treatment and care plans are to achieve these things. So there is this very important, so healthcare is a very important context for meaning making for all of us, care providers, patients, families alike. Now, the thing is that, I have, as I'm trying to make meaning of my life in this context, and I'm saying general as well, I need to bring my vulnerability. I need to say, gosh, this is what I think is really important, but I don't really know. Now, if I have power in that context, fine. If people will listen to my opinion because I talk the right way and I use the right language and I demonstrate the right sort of affect to people without upsetting them, we'll be fine. But there are people whose perspectives are deeply disenfranchised. It's very difficult for them to come and say, I'm trying to figure out what a good quality of life is. I'm also trying to figure out what my gender is. I'm trying to navigate questions of my own gender identity and my gender expression.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm doing this in a context where you're using language that's already pigeonholing me into ways that I'm resisting and I don't know yet. Or I'm assuming that what we're trying to do is cure this patient's heart disease and make their heart work well. And that's the exclusive problem that I'm trying to solve. Whereas I'm coming in with an understanding that there is a spiritual action happening here. And I'm trying to understand not only how to make this person's heart well, but their overall psyche and their overall emotional and spiritual experience well. Well, if the climate is hostile to those kinds of thoughts, it's not safe for me. I'm not culturally safe. And we can identify particular traditions of cultural traditions where we know that we are hostile. Our current contexts are hostile to these areas. So I think that I've gotten excited and I've started to say stuff, and I'm not sure anymore, Dale, if I'm answering your question. But what I want to say, I think, is that that's where this comes together, that leaders need to create spaces where we can critically reflect on the assumptions we're making about what kinds of language, what kinds of traditions and values and beliefs are acceptable, and then challenging and resisting those and creating the kind of inclusive environment that allows us all to come together to the hard problems we face and make meaning together. And that means, if we're tying it back to DEI, that means a hospitality to difference. It's okay for you to be different, an inclusion of different perspectives in the discussion, and equitable treatment, meaning paying more attention to those perspectives, those traditions, those ways of being and living that we know we are hostile to, and going out of our way to accommodate those in our conversations.
Well, first of all, I think you did answer my question, but I'll invite our listeners to leave us their comments. There is an evaluation we put at the end of this. And yeah, by all means, let us know whether Bashir answered the question and if there's anything else that you'd like to hear from him. But maybe just sort of as we move on to my final question, because you've talked about context a little bit, and maybe it's just a way of bringing this together. I think one is I thank you very much because you've done a remarkable job through all of this, I think, of connecting these conversations, which can be very philosophical and very deep, back into both real world experiences and understandings, and also how it expresses and looks in healthcare. So, so on that topic, I guess my final question to you is, I'm wondering, how does all this express itself in healthcare? Is the discussion, the pursuit of EDI and reconciliation different in healthcare in the face of patients, residents, and their families compared to if we were having this kind of conversation in the banking industry or the construction industry or any other part of our landscape? So your perspective on that?
I would say that what makes healthcare, in a sense, unique and uniquely important is that setting of meaning making at very important times in our lives that it offers. So that's where I think the difference. There's lots of different kinds of differences between healthcare and other contexts.
Mm-hmm.
Healthcare is not a commodity. It's not a cult. It's not the kind of thing that we can simply commercially exchange for various reasons, including the different power dynamics that exist in healthcare relationships, as opposed to in other commercial settings. I can go to different banks or different, purveyors of washing machines or automobiles if I don't like the service I'm getting, or if I can get a better deal somewhere else. In healthcare, I don't even know what I need. I need to trust someone else to tell me what's best for me. I need to trust them to put their own interests outside to meet my needs from my perspective. I'm usually in a setting that I don't feel comfortable in. I don't live in a hospital. I'm only there and I want to get the hell out of there as soon as I can. And so I don't understand the culture of the hospital. They use language that I don't understand. So there's all kinds of different power dynamics in the healthcare context that are different than other settings. But the biggest one for me is this idea of meaning making. That there are different times in our lives when we are most, you could put it on the context of vulnerability to having our meaning offended, but it's also, we have the greatest opportunity to make meaning in our lives. We're the most open to understanding, to thinking about what our life should be about. And that's a wonderful opportunity. It's one of the biggest gifts, in my opinion, of working in the healthcare context, because people who work in that context see difficulty in people's lives all the time and have the opportunity to participate in conversations about what life is about and how this particular intervention, whether it's dialysis or immunization, can improve someone's quality of life if they choose to look at it in that way. So that's what distinguishes the healthcare context, is that this is the greatest opportunity to actually ask hard questions about what kind of life do I want to live? What kind of life do I think is a useful, meaningful life to live? What kind of relationships do I want to preserve? What kind of activities in my life do I want to participate in? That's one thing. And then the other thing is that the sort of the flip side, the vulnerability side of that is, because of the enormous power dynamics, the power differential that our patients have relative to our care providers and others in positions of authority. And then within the patient community or population, the great diversity of power within that, because of the diversity and the historical discrimination and the current discrimination, that there's people who are needing the most help to make meaning of their lives and get access to resources to live well. And then there are people who are high risk of having their perspectives compromised and not heard because of inappropriate manifestations or demonstrations of power through systems and processes. And that vulnerability is scary because we can cause real harm to people, and the people who have the greatest demand on our society to meet their needs. And that's a real risk. So that's why it's important, I think, or unique.
Yeah, I think you've made the case. So, I mean, it's important in all parts of our life and our culture for sure. But I think what you've just described should reinforce for all of our listeners and others why, focusing on achieving, equity, diversity, and inclusion in our workplace is so critically important to how we as Canadians, I guess, live and live together and live well. So thank you. Any last words before we close, or back to you?
I hope this was somewhat useful. I really appreciate your interest in my perspective. And I also appreciate this because, every time I got the chance to tell my story, and it's in the telling of our stories that we understand ourselves. And so I'm critically reflecting on the kinds of things I said. Interesting. And I hope we all do that, because that's part of the journey to, as you say, helping us all to live well together. So thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you, Bashir. I'm very grateful, and I look forward to having another conversation with you. There's so much to learn from you. So thank you again, and wish you well.
And you, Dale. Thank you, and all your listeners.
You've been listening to the HQ, and I'm Dale Sherback, your host. You can find this and other future episodes on the CHA Learning website, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. We'd love to hear what you think, so please follow us on our other social media channels. Thanks for joining us in this discussion today. Please join us next time.